Okay, so I think we can start. Welcome everyone to the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism webinar on the iron and steel sector. So this event is organized by the Directorate General for Taxation and Custom Unions of the European Commission. My name is Xavier van den Bosch, and I will be the moderator today. So I'm part of the CBAM team together with my colleagues here in this room. And includes my colleagues Yanis Zachariadis, Ivica Orlovic, and Thomas Brinkman, who will guide you through this webinar. So first of all, a warm thank for all of your interest and for being here. This is the last of a webinar series on specific sectors, for the specific sectors covered by the CBAM. So in past weeks, we have already organized webinars on the cement sector, aluminium, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen sectors. So today's webinar on iron and steel will introduce the rules and requirements for the transitional period for importers and producers for this sector, as well as any other stakeholders interested in the CBAM from the EU or from non-EU countries. So the number of registrations to this webinar was very high. So for those that have registered but could not attend today due to capacity constraints, a second webinar on the iron and steel sector will take place next week, Thursday. And a final webinar will be provided also for national competent authorities of EU member states. So first, a few practical points about Zoom. Make sure that you appear with your name and affiliation. If needed, you can update your name by following the steps that you see here on the screen, because they will be useful for us when addressing your questions. Many participants have joined this meeting, so I would like to provide you with some important housekeeping rules. All participants will be muted during the presentation. Please note that we are recording this webinar and that you're not allowed to record it yourselves. The recording will be available on our website after this presentation. You may ask questions at any time using the chat. We will address them at the end of the webinar. We invite you to focus your questions on specifically the topic of today, the iron and steel sector and the transitional period, and not on other aspects of CBAM that are not covered in this webinar, of course, to allow us to focus on those questions. At the end of the webinar, you'll be invited to complete the feedback survey. This presentation will be available after the presentation. It will be uploaded on our main CBAM webpage. And finally, please note that during this webinar, presentations and answers to questions are meant to help you prepare for the CBAM. So in no circumstance, they can be interpreted as definitive views expressed by the European Commission or legally binding. So now that I have gone through those rules for this webinar, we would like you to please provide one answer to these questions that you see using the poll function that appears on your screen. And this will allow us to, get to have an idea of who you are overall. So now, many answers still coming in, but I see that many EU importers are there, but also non-EU producer, obviously, non-EU exporter, non-EU countries. Again, this is also a partial picture because we have still we had many registered participants who could not be here today. So, but many thanks for your answer. So let me guide you through the agenda for this webinar. So first, we will present you a general overview for the transitional period. We will then focus on the specific case of iron and steel in those different steps that you see on this slide. And finally, we'll briefly look at the CBAM transitional registry and the timelines for submitting CBAM reports. Now it's my pleasure to welcome our director, Maria Elena Scopio. So it's Director for Indirect Taxation and Tax Administration at DigiTaxud, to say a few welcoming words. So Elena, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Could you please confirm that you can hear me well? Yes. Great.
Yes.
Super. Thanks a lot. It is really a pleasure for me to welcome you to this webinar organized today on CBAM. CBAM is a cornerstone of our climate measures. The EU is currently trying to implement this one and the ones that have been adopted in the past months. CBAM was announced in 2019, you may remember, as part of the European Green Deal. It was then proposed in 2021 as part of the Fit for 55 package, was adopted this year, and has entered into force already last Sunday, although in its transitional phase. It is part of our very ambitious agenda that would like us to put us on a path to lower the greenhouse gas emissions by 55% in 2030, and to arrive to a full neutrality in 2050. This can be seen as ambitious targets, but if we take a step back and we look at the unprecedented climate crisis that we are currently experiencing this summer, the environment was telling us something was not good. We had scorching hot summers in floods, and this is not going to stop. This is only going to increase. So we have a planetary crisis, which is threefold. We have climate change, biodiversity loss, and also pollution. Acting, therefore, is not in question. It's not whether we are acting or not, but it's when we are putting these measures in place. So our objective has been to try to have environmental policies that could achieve our international commitments while minimizing their impact on trade. CBAM is one of these measures. With it, we try to put a fair price on carbon, the carbon that is emitted during the production of certain energy-intensive goods, carbon-intensive goods, and when they are entering the European borders. This is to try to put the goods that are entering our territory on the same level playing field as the goods that are produced in the territory of the European Union. This must be done in full transparency, having an important dialogue with all our partner countries, all the countries that will be called to deal with it when exporting to the European Union. We are working very, very well and very, very intensively with all of them. We are having contacts with several EU countries, and we are also trying to look for effective ways of lower carbon emissions globally. For this, we try also to support the global efforts, not only with those countries that may find it relatively easy to considering aligning with this policy, but also for those countries that may have more difficulty, like the least developed countries. You may know that the EU is one of the biggest contributors for the climate financing worldwide. So to do so, not only we are engaging with the public authorities and the international partners, we are also trying to reach all stakeholders. Public authorities, they were ones, not only of external, but of EU member states. They should be fully up to speed when having to deal with our transitional period in view of the definitive period of CBAM. We are also trying to reach, like in this case, businesses, federations, media, NGOs, operators, whoever has to be called to know what to do and how to do it and when to do it. To do so, we will have written guidance, online trainings, and these trainings include webinars like the one of today, but also e-learning courses. All this will be put regularly in the web page, which has been dedicated to this, which will be regularly adapted and also translated into the main spoken languages in the world. I hope you are not going to see CBAM as something which is a burden or which is unduly hampering trade with the European Union. It is a way to start discussing this issue also beyond our borders, because we can be as ambitious as we want, but if we are not trying to have a meaningful debate with all the other countries in the world, this is going to be absolutely worthless. I am happy that there are so many participants. I see that there is a relevance of importers, and you are, of course, the ones that are mostly interested in what's going to change as from this week. It shows also that there is a major interest worldwide, and that maybe we were able to have a communication campaign that could reach you, so that it could be very broad. Now, I leave you in the hands of my colleagues that are here to try to guide you through all these new rules. And I would like to repeat that we are at the disposal of everyone who will have to confront and deal with CBAM in the next months, in the next years. So have a very nice webinar, and thank you very much for being here.
Many thanks, Elena, for those introductory remarks. And I'm happy now to, can start, I think, to give you the floor, Yanis, who presented the main features of CBAM.
Thank you, Javier. Right, I can start. First of all, before we go into discussing the CBAM in detail, it is important to introduce the EU ETS. This is the EU emissions trading system. Since 2005, we have a carbon market in the EU, and that covers approximately 40% of the EU's economy. This measure has proven useful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and it is in line with our achieving our carbon targets. CBAM exists to complement and reinforce the EU ETS. The EU has stepped up its climate ambition, for instance, by gradually phasing out free allocation of allowances given to EU producers under the EU ETS, and seeing that as the EU is increasing its climate ambition, the CBAM is designed to mitigate the risk of carbon leakage. And what is this risk of carbon leakage? It's a risk that takes place, that happens when companies transfer production to places where decarbonization requirements are less stringent than those of the EU. And basically, when you replace products, EU products, with more carbon-intensive imports. And this would lead to increasing emissions globally, and therefore undermining our climate mitigation efforts. Now, this is where CBAM intervenes, to subject the import of certain goods to the same carbon price these products would have paid had they been produced in the EU. This is how it complements the EU ETS. CBAM puts a price, a carbon price, on imports of certain goods that are produced in non-EU countries, but imported into the EU. And this carbon price will be calculated so that it is equivalent to the one that these products would have paid had they been produced in the EU, had the producer been located into the EU and been subject to the EU carbon pricing system. Another important objective of CBAM is to encourage non-EU countries and their producers to decarbonize their production processes. Any clean innovation, any effort made by producers in third countries to decarbonize their production will translate into a reduction in CBAM obligation for the given products that are exported to the EU. Now, the CBAM was adopted at the EU level and officially entered into force in May 2023. This summer, the EU also adopted the implementing regulation laying down the reporting rules for the transitional period. And this will start, has already started, in fact, from the 1st of October 2023. The transitional phase is a 2-year period during which CBAM will focus on monitoring and reporting. Monitoring because it is a period that we consider to be a learning phase, and a learning phase for us all. That means a period through which we collect information on the embedded carbon content of goods covered under the CBAM regulation and imported into the EU. The information that we collect will help us refine the rules applicable for the calculation and the determination of carbon content in goods, and these rules will be applied in the definitive period. Basically, it's about rolling out the system and preparing everyone, including ourselves and the member states, and for the smooth kick-in of the definitive phasing of CBAM from the 1st of January 2026. Besides monitoring, there is reporting, and essentially reporting relates to the fact that during the entire period of the transitional period, reporting declarants, essentially the importers, will only need to comply with the reporting obligation. There will be no financial adjustment during this period. No CBAM certificate need to be surrendered during this period either. However, quarterly CBAM reports will need to be submitted describing the embedded carbon emissions of CBAM goods imported into the EU from the 1st of October 2023. Now, as you can see on the screen, the required information that will need to be reported includes the total quantity of each type of good expressed in megawatt hours for electricity, specified per installation producing the goods in the country of origin. The actual total embedded emissions of each type of good expressed in tons of CO2 emission per tons of CO2 emission. The carbon price due in the country of origin for the embedded emission in the imported goods, taking into account relevant rebates or other forms of compensation. And the third, you may be wondering why the carbon price paid in the country of origin needs to be reported on. Given that there is no financial obligation during the transitional period, indeed, importers will only receive a deduction for the carbon price already paid during the definitive phase, but we need to collect data already during the transitional period to make sure that we are ready to provide deduction from 2026 onwards. Similarly, the reporting during the transitional period covered both direct and indirect emissions for the same objective of collecting data and refining the mechanism during the definitive phase if needed. Another point is sanctions. Member states, national competent authorities, may impose penalties for failure to comply with reporting obligations. For instance, where declarants have not taken any steps to submit their CBAM report, or when there is a clear bad faith in reporting or in the dialogue between the reporting declarant and the national authority. And finally, this webinar is not presenting the definitive phase of CBAM. But you should be aware that from 2026, the reporting embedded emissions will need to be verified by an EU accredited verifier, following the same principles as those under the EU ETS. There will also be a gradual phasing of CBAM financial adjustment from 2026 to 2034, during which time free allowances under the EU ETS will be gradually phased out. So, the imported and EU products will always pay a similar carbon price. Now, moving on to describe in a bit more detail the emissions that are subject to the scope of CBAM. And in principle, CBAM reflects what is happening in the EU within the context of the EU ETS. In order to clarify the emissions we are discussing, let's categorize them in scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, based on the greenhouse gas protocol. EU ETS applies to scope 1 emissions, and CBAM focuses on direct emissions. And these are emissions generated from the production of those goods at installation level. Direct emissions include emissions from the production of heating and cooling, even if that production takes place outside the installation. However, the EU ETS applies across the board in the EU to industrial emissions and power generation. Therefore, more emissions need to be taken into account in CBAM. Specifically, emissions released in producing an electricity in the production of CBAM goods, that is scope 2 emissions, are also within the scope of CBAM. During the transitional period, it is necessary to report those scope 2 indirect emissions for all goods falling under the scope of CBAM. In the definitive period, starting from 2026, there will be some differentiations, notably the iron and steel, as well as the aluminium sectors. EU producers in those of these materials may receive state aid compensation for the carbon price they include in the relation of the electricity that they use. Finally, for the same reason, certain scope 3 emissions are pertinent within the scope of the CBAM. They encompass upstream emissions from CBAM goods that are used as inputs into what we term as complex goods. These are materials which are also called precursors. My colleagues Thomas Brinkman and Ivica Orlovic will provide further explanation of this later. Other scope 3 emissions, such as downstream emissions, namely from consumption of goods downstream, transportation, and distribution, are not covered by the mechanism.
Thanks a lot, Yanis. And now let's move to the second part of this presentation, which is focused on the determination of embedded emissions for the R&C sector. Ivica, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Javier. This section will be most technical one. First, it's important to give a more detailed description on the key terms in the CBAM. We have simple goods. Simple goods in case of iron and steel is sinter or is identified. Regarding complex goods are goods produced from the simple or other complex goods. Production processes are parts of an installation in which chemical or physical processes are carried out to produce goods under an aggregate goods category. Production route, a specific technology used in the production process to produce goods. And finally, we have aggregated goods category, the groups for which joint production processes are to be defined for the purpose of monitoring. This slide and the next slide show the relevant goods in the scope for the CBAM transitional period in the iron and steel sector. The aggregated goods category include both finished goods and precursor goods that are consumed in the production of iron and steel products. The aggregated goods on the left are groups for which joint production processes are to be defined for the purpose of monitoring. Additionally, iron and steel products are considered complex goods. It's necessary to include, of course, embedded emissions from the relevant precursors used in production processes. Here you can see the 5 steps to determine embedded emissions. As a first step, declarants need to define installation boundaries, the production processes and routes, which means you need to identify the goods under CBAM scope. The installation needs to look as installation vis-a-vis the goods that are subject to the CBAM, and then define installation boundaries as well as the production processes. As a second step, you need to determine the relevant parameters and select the monitoring method for all the emissions. As a third step, you will need to ensure that further data needed for attributed emissions like heating, cooling, electricity consumption, waste gases, and their respective emissions gases. As a fourth step, you will need to monitor relevant precursor material, imported quantity per installation of origin, and specific embedded emissions. Also, there's a need to determine the activity level, the amount of CBAM goods, produced at specific embedded emissions per ton. In the fifth and final step, you will need to determine embedded emissions of the CBAM goods per ton, and if needed, you may use preliminary default values. Default values we will explain in later stage. Here is one example defining the system boundaries. Here you can see the definition of system boundaries through 5 production processes. This way of defining system boundaries is used if, for example, it is not 100% used pig iron and crude steel for production iron and steel products. In this example, if it's, of course, for example, pig iron and crude steel are used 100%, then this approach, which we call the bubble approach, can be used. As one process, electricity is divided in its second process. We come to step 2. In general, it's necessary to monitor direct emissions using methodologies such as a standard method, mass balance, or continuous emissions monitoring. If it's relevant, direct emissions include emissions from the production of heat and waste gases, even if that production takes place outside the installation. We are still in step 2, monitoring of direct emissions through first the calculation-based approach. This uses the quantities of all fuels, relevant materials consumed, and corresponding calculation factor. Second is the measurement-based approach. This involves measuring the concentration of the greenhouse gases, as well as the flow of flue gas for each emission source. As a third part, we have other monitoring systems, may be elaborated during the introductory period until 31st of July 2024. The operator may apply other methods allowed for emissions monitoring in their jurisdiction if they lead to similar emission coverage and accuracy. These other methods may include default values made available and published by the European Commission for the transition period, or any other default values. It's important to say that the Commission will publish default values by the end of 2023, well in time to contribute to the reports that importers need to submit by the end of January 2024. The report from the EU Joint Research Center will feed into preparation of these default values. The web link for this report you will find on our one-stop shop website. As a part of the flexibility in terms of reporting, there are additional monitoring and reporting methods that may be used until 31st December 2024, provided they offer similar coverage and accuracy of emissions data. These methods are a carbon pricing scheme, compulsory emissions monitoring scheme, and emission monitoring scheme. Also, there are other reference methods, including default values that can be used until 31st of July 2024, if the reporting declarant doesn't have all necessary information. In the case of complex goods, including the use of default values, there is estimation of up to 20% of the total embedded emissions without a time limit. Now we are moving to step 3. This is probably the most complicated step with the formula display. This formula provides a guide about which parameters need to be monitored whenever an installation has more than one production processes, or where the heat supply is separated, or even where waste gases or electricity production are found in an installation. The second part of this step is related to the attribution of indirect emissions. For the transitional period of the CBAM, indirect embedded emissions must be reported separately from the direct embedded emissions for all covered goods. Indirect emissions of installation of production processes are considered equivalent to emissions generated by production of electricity consumed with installation or production processes of the goods, respectively multiplied with the applicable emission factor for electricity. Now we are coming to last two steps, 4 and 5. The embedded emissions at the process level only need to be divided by activity level of the process in order to arrive at the specific embedded emissions of the produced goods. For complex goods, when calculating specific embedded emissions, it is necessary to take into account amount of precursors that were used in the production of the goods and specific embedded emissions of the precursor. Now, my colleague Thomas will follow up with some case scenarios, worked examples for the iron and steel.
Yeah, thank you, Ivica. So we have chosen an example for the iron and steel webinar that covers the production of carbon steel with the blast furnace and basic oxygen furnace rule. And the example plant we're looking here is an integrated steel plant. So it starts from the iron ore, includes a blast furnace, a basic oxygen furnace, and then the further processing of the crude steel into different iron or steel products through processes such as hot rolling and then cold rolling or preparing the rails. In addition, at this site, there's also a plant that produces electricity using the off gases, which is called on the CBAM in this case the waste gases that come from the blast furnace. So each of these different parts of the installation can be defined as a separate production process. In the end, we have in this example 5 production processes, and the CBAM methodology could be applied to each of them, to each of these 5 processes. But if that is done, in that case, one would have to calculate basically the output of each of these separate processes, determine the specific embedded emissions, and then use that value and carry it forward to the next calculation. The products that we are talking about here are, what comes out of the sinter plant is sintered ore. That is a simple good in CBAM terms. Ivica has explained the meaning of that, because all the input materials that are used to produce the sintered ore are not CBAM goods themselves. Following in the chain, the next one would be the pig iron. That is, in CBAM terms, already a complex good, because the specific embedded emissions of the sintered ore have to be taken into account in the calculation. Sintered ore is a simple good, and any CBAM good that relies on input materials that are themselves CBAM goods, then are complex goods. And of course, then in the sequence, the crude steel and the final iron or steel products, they are also all complex goods. Okay, I think we can move to the next slide. So now we have basically the same scheme, but with much more details, and we look at the different inputs and also where the emissions occur for direct emissions. So we have as relevant inputs here the iron ore, then we have coke. It's used both in the sinter plant and the blast furnace. The blast furnace also uses some plastics waste as input material. We have some external steel scrap that is used in the process, that is used in the basic oxygen furnace. Natural gas is used as fuel in several of the different production processes. It's used to fuel the basic oxygen furnace, but also the further production processes. And we have last but not least there in the list, lime as an input to facilitate the slag formation that is used both in the blast furnace and in the basic oxygen furnace. Okay, so and for each of these different production processes, we have emissions of greenhouse gases. So for the iron steel sector, as explained, only carbon dioxide is relevant. But in each of these production processes, there are CO2 emissions occurring. And the emissions are basically either because of fuel combustion or because what we call on the CBAM process emissions. So, for example, the steel scrap that enters the process has some carbon in it, some impurities, and they might really be released from the process and might be a source of emissions. The most important process emissions is, of course, from the coke. Okay. Thanks. Next slide. Again, the same, basically the same scheme, but now we focus on indirect emissions. So indirect emissions are related to electricity consumption, and the scheme shows how all the production processes where electricity is used. Basically, it's in all of the 4 processes, 1, 2, 3, 4. And in this specific case example, the assumption is that the installation buys some of the electricity, purchases it, and gets it from the grid, but a share of the electricity is also generated on site. And how is it generated? It is done by combusting the waste gas in a power plant, and the electricity generated there is then directly used in the installation. Okay, we come to the next slide, that we have also already shown, and Ivica has mentioned it, is that is the possibility of simplifying the calculation of the embedded emissions for this plant. It basically consists in taking together different production processes and define them as one. So what was formerly production process 1, 2, 3, 4 is here now combined as one. The power plant where the electricity is generated is still a separate one. The aim of this is to facilitate the calculation of the emissions, but it comes under a condition. That simplification is only possible if none of the intermediate products is sold or transferred out of the installation. So basically, all the sinter produced in the sinter plant is used in the blast furnace, or the pig iron coming out of the blast furnace is then used in the next step, and so on. So only under this condition, if that is not, that condition is not met, then one would have to do a calculation for individual production processes and then make a carryover calculation, basically to take the specific embedded emissions of the products of one process that are then the input to the next process. So this is basically the precursor concept. So we have already gone through the input materials. So they are now given here in red on the scheme. So basically all what is in red needs to be monitored in terms of quantity. So how much of that materials is used, and in terms of quality. So in terms of carbon content. The electricity that is generated in the power plant that's still in blue here, that should also be red. So why do all these variables need to be monitored? That's because we need them for the calculation of the embedded emissions. And in this specific case, we apply a mass balance approach. Maybe, yes, next slide. Maybe some of you have already followed one of the other webinars. There, the methodology we have explained, the examples were basically, I think, always the standard methodology. which is a very convenient and relatively easy way in the case of other CBAM goods, where the plant configuration is a bit simpler. For the steel sector in particular, the mass balance method is often more appropriate, in particular for such a big integrated plant, because the mass balance method, it is easier to take into account carbon that enters the process, but also carbon that leaves the process with the products. So how does the mass balance in principle work? Basically, we determine all the carbon that goes into the installation with raw materials, with fuels, with other auxiliary materials, and we determine all the carbon that goes out of the installation with the products. And the products could be really the products that are sold on the market, but the products could also be some residues, some solid residues, some waste. And once one has done that, one makes a difference, and the difference is basically the carbon that has gone into the atmosphere has been emitted. So how more concretely here, I will not go through all, not through all the numbers, but in principle, let's take one line here. The first one, the coke fines that are used in the sintering plant. One determines how much of these coke fines is used in the reference period. That is then multiplied with the carbon content. Here's the assumption of 88%. Okay, and then one still needs to multiply that number with a factor that is given below the table, the amount of carbon dioxide that is generated per ton of carbon. Okay, so multiplying these three factors gives basically the emissions due to the use of coke fines in the sinter plant. Okay, and one does that for all other input materials in the process. A specific case is here this plastics waste. Well, that's not only plastics waste, it's rather mixed waste, and it contains some biomass. And biomass emissions under the EU emissions trading system are exempted. I mean, either if the biomass is used as a raw material, or if the biomass is used as fuel and fulfills the sustainability and greenhouse gas savings criteria. So the assumption here in this example is that, yes, these criteria are fulfilled. So the biomass fraction, the biomass is 16% of this plastics waste, does not count. So we do not only, for this specific plastics waste, we do not only have to multiply the numbers that I said before, the amount of waste used, the carbon content and this emission factor, but we also have to deduct basically 16%, which is due to biomass. So once one has done that for all these input materials and summed them up, then one has the total direct emissions from the installation. I'm sorry. No, that was not correct. One has basically the emissions that result from the input materials. Now we have to look at on the negative side. So basically the carbon that goes out of the installation through the products, could it be steel or through other solid materials? In this case, it's the slags that leave the installation. So again, we have an amount of steel products produced or slags that are generated. It is multiplied with the carbon content and with this factor given below the table, and then one gets basically to negative figures, and these are deducted from the figures that was calculated before, and then we arrive at the total direct emissions of the installation. The next step is now to calculate the total attributed value. Since that was the long equation that Riza presented before, that does take into account not only the emissions directly generated at installation, but also flows of heat or of waste gases over the installation boundaries. So with the previous calculation, basically we have assumed that all the carbon that has entered the process and not gone out of the installation through the steel products or through the slag is emitted. But that's not entirely true because if you remember the scheme, a part of the waste gases actually was transferred to the power plant. And then the power plant will combust these waste gases. And actually the emissions happen then there at the power plant. So the principle how this works with this waste gas correction is now that, let's say that the emissions, although physically they occur at the power plant, a share of these emissions is attributed to the steel production, and a share is attributed to the power plant. With the mass methodology so far, we have basically attributed all emissions to the steel plant. But because that is not correct, because some attribution needs to be done to the power plant, there is here a deduction, a subtraction of a value. How does it work? Basically, one takes the calorific value of these waste gases that can be again calculated by the waste gas volume multiplied by the net calorific value, and then what's this energy figure. And then there's a specific formula to calculate this deduction, and it takes into account the emission factor of natural gas and a correction factor of 0.667. So when these numbers are multiplied, then one comes here to a figure of minus 478,000 or 79,000 rounded tons per year. And this is the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that needs to be subtracted. This example, you can also find it in the guidance. Just to note that in the guidance, there are still some small mistakes and a bit of inconsistencies. And this is one, because in the guidance, the figures are a bit differently because it was forgotten to take into account this factor of 0.667. So now basically we have calculated the attributed direct emissions. Now we go to the calculation of the indirect emissions of the installation. There, well, one needs to determine what is the total electricity consumption, okay, of the whole installation to produce the steel. And in this specific case, we have, and that electricity consumption needs to be multiplied with an emission factor. The emission factor that is corresponding to the electricity that is consumed. Well, we have in this example, a specific case is that, and the assumption is that the installation purchases 25% of the electricity from the grid, and 75% are coming from are produced by a power plant on the site. And that means that while the emission factor of these two electricity sources is likely different. In the example for the electricity from the grid, it was assumed that the installation for the calculations would use a default value that is established per country, and that is basically the first option during the transitional period for CBAM. These default values are based on average emission factors of data from the International Energy Agency. They are provided in the system and can be just taken from the system. As explained before, it is also possible to use other default factors for the country if they are publicly available. If they're published, then one need to use a reference. Or it would also be possible to use actual emission factors, but that would comes under the condition that there is a direct technical link or a power purchase agreement. So that's the emission factor for the electricity from the grid. For the electricity from the waste gas combustion, well, that's can basically be determined by the installation itself. So I mean, this is somehow an example for the use of an actual emission factor, because we assume that this power plant is on the site, and then there's a direct technical link, so a power transmission line that delivers basically electricity from the power plant to the steel plant. Basically, the calculation of this emission factor would be determine the emissions at the power plant and divided by the electricity that was produced at the power plant. So there's a certain value. And now for the total electricity consumption, which we already know, the total installations, we need to determine this emission factor, and that is basically done just by a weighted average. So taking 25% of the a little bit higher electricity factor from the grid, plus the 75% contribution from the other. So once we have the emission factor of the whole installation, we multiply it with the total electricity consumption, and that gives us then the total indirect emissions. Just to note also that here in the guidance, the figures are a bit different because there was some kind of rounding issue. So intermediate has been rounding here in the tables or in the calculations in the Excel file. So that's why the figures are not exactly the same, but we will correct that with one of the next guidance updates. So now we have the total attributed direct emissions. We have the total attributed indirect emissions. Now we need to determine how much goods are produced in the installation. So that's on the next slide. Example figures given. Assumption, I mean, it's a simple calculation. It's rough figures. So there was a pig iron production of 4 million tons per year. You see the next one is the crude steel. That is 5 million tons. That is like 20% higher. Why is that? Because we had a lot of scrap from external sources entering into the basic oxygen furnace to produce the crude steel. The crude steel is then further processed, and in the example, that installation produces sheets, bars, and rails in different amounts. If you sum up all of them, you arrive at 4.8 million tons of these iron or steel products produced. So there's a little difference, and this is 200,000 that apparently in this installation arises as scrap from cuttings or whatever, and they were recycled back. So the important figure here on this slide is this 4.8 million tons of goods produced under the CBAM codes that were already on the previous slides. So, and in the last slide, that calculation is now pretty simple. To calculate the specific embedded emissions, direct and indirect, we need the total attributed direct and indirect emissions calculated before, and we divide that simple figure just simply by the 4.8 million tons produced, and then we come to the specific embedded emissions, direct, indirect, or total. As already mentioned, that example is given in the guidance document. There's also another example for an electric arc furnace, which today we cannot present because of the time constraint, but can only invite you to look at these examples to better understand. And as I said, we know that on this example, but also on the others, we still need to do a bit of refinements on the calculation.
Many thanks, Thomas, for this very complete presentation. So let's move to the third part of the presentation, which is about the different CBAM actors and the obligations for reporting to clearance. So, Yanis,
thank you.
For you, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Xavier. We've already received quite a few questions on the clarification of actors and the reporting steps. So we hope already with these slides we can provide some clarity. So to start with, just to highlight the main actors in the implementation of CBAM. First of all, we have the authorities responsible for the implementation, the European Commission, which has the role of reviewing CBAM reports communicated by the reporting declarants. The European Commission also communicates to the national competent authorities in the member states a list of reports for which it has reasons to believe that they are not compliant with the CBAM rules. And the European Commission also has the role of monitoring the implementation of CBAM, its progress, and to identify any risks of circumvention. Then we have the national competent authorities in the EU member states, who, with the support of the Commission, they check the CBAM reports and they engage in dialogue with reporting declarants if necessary. Ultimately, to ensure compliance with CBAM rules and requirements, they, if needed, engage in dialogue and ask additional questions. From 2025 onwards, they also start providing status of authorized CBAM declarants in order to be ready for implementation from 2026 in the definitive period. The third set of authorities that is responsible for the implementation of CBAM is the customs authority. They inform the importing declarants of the various CBAM obligations. They also check the EORI number of the importer or the representative, and they provide data on the imported goods subject to the CBAM scope to the Commission. Regarding checks of goods at border, of course, these different for the goods subject to CBAM. In particular, they're different for electricity vis-a-vis the material goods that are subject to CBAM. The authorities won't check the EORI number, for example, of electricity as a good. Then we have the reporting declarants. The role needs to be that they show the EORI number upon entry of CBAM goods into the EU. They should be prepared to deliver data relating to the embedded emissions to the producer of the good, and they submit the CBAM reports. Beyond each actor's role, let's also stress that CBAM also requires a regular dialogue and communication between the different actors. In particular, dialogue between the Commission and the national competent authorities will be important, especially for the review of the CBAM report. Now, moving on to look into who are the reporting declarants and what are their differences, if any, to the importers of CBAM goods. CBAM applies to goods imported into the EU, but who precisely is the one responsible of carrying out the reporting obligation? It is often the importer of the CBAM good who the reporting declarant is, meaning the person responsible for undertaking the CBAM reporting. However, sometimes the importer is not the reporting declarant. There are different situations. If the importer is based in the EU, there are several possibilities. Either the importer chooses to be the reporting declarant for CBAM purposes, or the importer can appoint a customs representative. If the importer decides to appoint a customs representative, then this representative can be either direct representative or indirect representative. In the first case, the importer is still liable for the CBAM reporting obligation. In the case of indirect representative, if they agree, they bear the responsibility for the reporting obligation. The importer is not based in the EU, then it is more straightforward. The importer must appoint an indirect customs representative as the reporting declarant for CBAM purposes. There is no other choice. Finally, we should note that there is no specific authorization procedure for national competent authorities to grant reporting declarant status during the transitional period. This means that you will be able to undertake the reporting as soon as you receive your credentials from your national competent authority and as soon as the reporting period starts. However, for the definitive period, there will be a procedure. There will be a procedure as such, and an application will need to be made in order to obtain a status of authorized CBAM declarant. This procedure will be introduced from 2025, as I mentioned earlier, and ahead of the entry into force in the definitive period in order to allow for sufficient time for importers to prepare and obtain an authorization status. Moving on to look into a bit more detail the steps to comply with the CBAM reporting obligations. If you're an importer of CBAM goods, the first thing you will need to do will be to determine how CBAM scope impacts you. For example, what goods you import into the EU, and if those goods are covered under the CBAM scope. And you need to understand how these goods match against the aggregated goods category that is listed in the CBAM implementing regulation. To answer this question, you must compare your CBAM codes of the goods that you import into the EU against the list of goods given in the Annex 1 of the CBAM regulation. As a second step, you will have to align with the reporting period of the operator. By default, the calendar year is the one suggested. However, if the producing installation is situated in a country with a different calendar year, or where there are reasonable arguments for a different period to be used, then this may be used also, but only if it covers at least 3 months. As a third step, you must be aware of the type of information that you're to declare regarding the CBAM goods that you import. What information do you need to request from your operator, from the operator of the installation producing the goods that you imported? As my colleagues explained earlier, there are choices to be made regarding the approaches to calculate the emissions of goods that are to be reported by the importer. What are the direct emissions, which methodology the operator of the installation has chosen to calculate those emissions, what are the indirect emissions, are there any precursors involved in the production, and if yes, were they produced in the same installation or in another installation in the same country or in a third country. And as an importer, you are responsible for monitoring and collecting the data on embedded emissions from the operator of the installations from where you imported those goods. Finally, you will need to report information on the carbon price that has been paid in the country or the subnational region, and if there is a carbon price in place, of course. This is important in the EU during the monitoring phase in order to gain knowledge, but also for the future. And it will be absolutely key to understand the pricing schemes applicable, carbon pricing schemes applicable in third countries, because in the future, a deduction will be able to be made from the financial adjustment that will be applicable to CBAM goods from 2026. In order to ensure that there is no double carbon price paid. As you may acknowledge, all of these steps require regular cooperation and communication between importers and operators of installations producing CBAM goods. Monitoring and reporting is possible only if parties have a regular dialogue. In order to help this regular dialogue and this communication, we have developed 2 tools. First, a framework which summarizes the information to be reported. This is in Annex 4 of the implementing regulation that was published in August 2023. And also a recommendation template which serves as a basis for importers to gather data from the operators of the installations. This was also made available, and it can be found on the dedicated website that we have for CBAM under the DG TaxSuite's website. Obviously, these 2 tools are not mandatory for you to use, but they're there to help you in order to fulfill the reporting obligations under the mechanism. We encourage you to make best use of these. For instance, if importers which import CBAM goods into the EU from several producers located in different countries with different languages, or for producers of CBAM goods in non-EU countries, exporting CBAM goods into the EU but via multiple importers, they can have a single data communication template to use, and this can make really your life easier. Despite all this, in cases where the information to be reported by importers is not available at the time when CBAM goods are being imported into the EU, importers will be able to use default values on the CO2 emissions of each good imported into the EU until 31st of July 2024. In addition, production sites outside the EU will have the possibility to register with the EU central database to communicate their emission reports. This should facilitate compliance for any importer of CBAM goods produced on these sites. Now, on this last section, we try to provide a snapshot of the CBAM transitional registry. That is the dedicated IT platform to facilitate reporting, and some basic information about the timelines of the transitional period. During the transitional periods, reporting declarants will submit reports via the CBAM transitional registry. This is a standardized, secured electronic database developed and managed by the Commission to ensure an efficient implementation of reporting obligations. It will collect the information reported during the transitional period by the reporting declarants. The registry will be deployed from the start of the transitional period and has gone live already from the 1st of October 2023. Reporting declarants will be able to declare the reporting as soon as they receive their credentials from the national competent authority of the member state, and as soon as the reporting period starts. The registry will be used for communication between many stakeholders implementing CBAM, and especially between national competent authorities and reporting declarants. The Commission will not directly enter into dialogue with the reporting declarants. It is very important to stress that in no circumstances will the information stored in the registry will be made accessible to the public, to non-users of the registry. Data and communication exchanges between the users of the transitional registry will be kept secured and confidential. For instance, data on installation in non-EU countries or on goods and exchanges between importers and the national competent authority. The CBAM transitional registry will not be used for enforcement, as the information collected will solely serve to feed into the data analysis and collection during the transitional period. Finally, the registry will also be the basis for the development and establishment of the CBAM registry in the definitive period. In this slide, we provide a snapshot of the transitional registry and it's essentially its main page. Once a reporting declarant has logged in, they will see on their screen the main page where they can find all the services and functionalities to comply with reporting requirements. This is where they need to go and submit their CBAM reports, manage the reports, and store all the relevant information. That is quarterly reports, installation relevant from where they imported the goods, the operators, importers, and there is a section with information on the profile of the reporting declarant. Now, reporting declarants will be able to navigate using these various pages to gather, retrieve, upload, edit, save, and correct, if necessary, all the necessary information in order to submit their CBAM reports. All the functionalities of this single platform have been designed to help and facilitate the communication to all parties, monitor and to inform and to track any information needed in a consistent and time-effective manner for declarants and for authorities, while also ensuring high level of confidentiality. In my quarterly reports, reporting declarants will have access to information about past and current CBAM reports. In my installations, they will find information about installations producing CBAM goods that they have registered in relation to the reporting declarants account. In operators, information will be stored about operators managing the installations in relation to the reporting declarants account. In my importers, information will be stored about importers that have been registered in relation to the account of the reporting declarant. And in my profile information, this is where the details of the reporting declarants account will be stored. Now, moving on to have a look at the timeline of all the reporting requirements during the transitional period. As you can notice, flexibilities have been provided in the implementing act governing the transitional period. For example, the first two CBAM reports, which are due respectively on the 31st of January 2024 and 30th of April 2024, can be modified until the end of July 2024. And for all other quarterly reports, reporting declarants will be given the possibility to correct the reports up to 2 months after the end of the reporting period. During the definitive period, CBAM reports will become CBAM declarations, and they will cover a calendar year. They will be annual. This means that the first report, the first reporting period in the definitive period for the year 2026 will need to be submitted in 2027. Finally, I would like to mention that we have published a provisional list of national competent authorities of member states on the CBAM dedicated website, which will be updated regularly as soon as we receive information from EU member states. You will be able to log in as soon as you retrieve your credentials from your national competent authority, so that you can get familiar with functionalities of the registry before you can undertake the reporting for the first reporting period, which opens, which will open from January 2024. And finally, some useful information of where you can find more material and more information on CBAM. We have a one-stop shop webpage where we upload all the new documents and information. And we can assist you via continuous and updated documentation by inviting you to undertake the e-learning courses that we upload regularly for each CBAM sector, as well as read our fact sheets, our Q&A, and so on. This is an important learning period, so our message is that we will be there to support you.
Many thanks, and we will now take a 5-minute break. This is meant to allow us to gather all the questions that you have submitted and organize a bit effectively the answers. Yeah, see you then in 5 minutes. Many thanks. Many thanks for your patience for this small break. So, of course, you asked a lot of different questions. I think a lot of those answers will come also through further checking the available information. We very much invite you in particular to have a look at the guidance document, but nevertheless, we'll try to cover the most important, most frequent ones right now. And we will start with with the presentations on, follow-up questions on the presentation regarding the obligations on the importers, the procedures. There were a number of questions on this.
Yes,
Yanis?
yes. First of all, thank you very much for sending your questions, which we see that they keep on coming through. Just to touch upon some of the more repeated questions to clarify once again that first of all, reporting during the transitional period is to be done on a quarterly basis, and that turns into an annual-based declaration during the definitive period from 2026. In order to submit your declarations from 2026 onwards, then the importer will need to be an authorized CBAM declarant, and this authorization process will start from the 1st of January 2025. So it is from that date that you can apply to your national competent authority in order to receive authorization to become an authorized CBAM declarant, in order to be ready to submit formal declarations from 2026. And that's for the definitive period, but that's I'm reflecting that because it has been repeated in many of the questions. During the transitional period for the next 2 years that we are discussing here today, as I say, reporting will be done on a quarterly basis. Reporting is done on the basis of the EORI number in accordance to what has been imported into the EU under that EORI number. Access to the CBAM transitional registry can be provided to you by your national competent authority. We appreciate that not all member states have yet indicated their the corresponding national competent authority. Information on that will be updated regularly on our website, and you will be able to find this information in order to seek out to your national competent authority in order to be given the credentials to access the transitional registry. I think I can stop there and pass the floor to my colleague for some of the more technical questions.
Okay, many thanks. Thomas?
Yeah, thank you. There are many technical questions, and as Xavier already said, we will go through them and use them for the guidance updates that will take in place in the next weeks, and it's likely a continuous process. I will try to address a few that I have seen repeatedly. Starting with maybe on the reference period for reporters, as my colleague Yanis has said, reporting is every 3 months, quarterly reports. But the reference period, I mean, when you calculate the embedded emissions, that is usually 1 year, because in order to avoid short-term fluctuations, that's a more suitable. And ideally, it would be the last year, but it could still be that in the first quarter, maybe not the data of the last year are available, and then it could be even a year before. There were a number of questions on the system boundaries. So what processes, or sub-process and activities to include in when calculating the embedded emissions. For each of the different CN codes, so for the goods, we have grouped them in the implementing integration into aggregated goods categories, and for each of those goods categories, you can find descriptions on what are relevant emission sources and how the system boundaries should be set. Basically, everything that is related to the production of a CBAM good is included. I mean, it could be auxiliary processes, and maybe you have you need distilled water, and that consumes some energy and has some emissions. That would of course be attributed to the production, including it could even include the building of heatings. Transport on site is also included in the site. If you have, for example, a conveyor belt, transport outside the installation boundaries is not included. Okay, so that's excluded. But everything that happens on the at the installation and that is related to the production, if you have a certain auxiliary process that serves multiple purposes, both for the production of a CBAM good and maybe for the production of something else, well, then in the calculation, some kind of attribution would have to be maybe 30% of the energy used is actually for the CBAM good and 70 for them. Some kind of attribution would then have to take place. Okay, that was on the system boundaries. A number of questions on the default values and again on these exemptions for reporting. So let me briefly recap it. From 2025, it's basically reporting using the CBAM methodology that we have described in detail today. Until the end of 2024, there are flexibilities. And one is to use another methodology that can be maybe one that is used in another emissions trading system. It can be a methodology used that is prescribed in the country of origin, or it could be a methodology used by the installation. For example, the installation has its own environmental management system, or maybe a corporate reporting standard and so on. That is an own methodology that could also be used until the end of 2024. The second possibility for derogation flexibility is to use estimations. Estimations are until July 2024. And estimations, it is written like that, and can be seen in the wide sense. And in the wide sense, it means it includes default values. And as probably it was, I think, also already answered in the chat, and said, the default values will be published by the Commission by the end of the year. There is a JRC report available. The link was also mentioned that will feed into the decision of what the default values are. But default values are just one example of an estimation. The flexibility installations could also make their own estimations, or maybe use values that they find in other sources. Okay, and the third question was on this 20%. That derogation from the methodology applies throughout the whole transitional period, so that's valid until the end of 2025. But it has a limitation in the scope, so it can only cover 20% of the total embedded emissions. So not 20% both for direct and 20% for indirect. It's for the total. Okay. So if there is in an installation a process step with a minor contribution to the overall emissions, or if maybe there is a sequence of production where output from one plant is used as input in the next one, and then actually in this sequence of different plants, in one plant, actually there are not many greenhouse gas emissions, so they could then be estimated. Questions on indirect emissions and the emission factors. I mentioned that the most important, the first avenue to take when reporting indirect emissions would be to use IEA data. They are free to use as they are in the CBAM registry. They will not be published as such because IEA charges for them, but the averages that we will provide per country can be used. The question on the power purchase agreements, the legislation that we have in place is that certificates of origin or guarantees of origin or green certificates are not accepted when reporting actual emission, when using actual emission factors, but power purchase agreements are. Without further specification at this stage for the transitional period, what elements should be in that power purchase agreement. And finally, a few remarks on very specific questions on waste gas. That's, of course, an important point here in the iron and steel sector. The rules that are applied for the reporting, they differ. Was one participant mentioned that they differ from the greenhouse gas protocol. Why is that? It is because these rules mirror what is used in the EU ETS, and there is very, very precise rules on how much this waste gas, it is carbon contained in emissions, how much the emissions are then attributed to the steel plant and how much to the power plant. And this is also why these specific rules are taken over, that when you calculate it from both sides, that the calculation for exports is not the same as the calculation for imports. That's it, finally, without going into further details because the time is limited.
Okay, many thanks, Thomas. And well, indeed, we not answer to all your questions, but in any case, this will feed also further review, and we see how we can best address them or clarify some points in further updates of the guidance. Consider also feeding the Q&A on our main CBAM webpage. So again, many thanks for your participation, for your interest. As I mentioned earlier, you will receive a feedback survey, which we can invite you to share your thoughts, how we can possibly improve those kind of sessions. Well, all information is available on our main CBAM webpage. So thank you all and have a very nice day. Thank you.